My name is John O'Sullivan, and I'm I'm not the distinguished conductor. I'm the president of the Danube Institute, and this is an event which the Danube Institute is doing jointly with the Hungarian Review, whose editor, Gyula Kodolányi, is about to take command of the dais. I am a colleague of Gyula's both on this occasion, but also as associate editor of the Hungarian Review. I think we would both say that this is for us an extremely happy occasion as well as a distinguished one. Because the Hungarian Review collectively, and Gyula and I in particular, feel that in publishing the essays of Nicholas Parsons, Civilisation and Its Malcontents, that we are celebrating the discovery of Mr. Parsons by Hungarian Review. Now, just as, of course, America existed before it was discovered by Christopher Columbus, so Mr. Parsons had an existence, indeed a very distinguished existence as a writer before we discovered him in our pages. He is the author of 17 books before this particular book. But we feel that we discovered a talent that had been recognized but not sufficiently celebrated, because as this book of essays shows, Mr. Parsons is an astonishingly varied and versatile writer. He tackles a wide range of subjects, and every subject he tackles, he adorns. So he is describing in his book all of the troubles, the discontents, the successes of the modern world. He examines them with some historical looking back cleverly, and well, he does a lot of things which we as editors found were wonderful, because when a Nick Parsons article arrives, you more or less say, well, we'll have to look through it first just in case there are a few typos, but otherwise we can send it to the printers more or less as it is. And we're very grateful for that, and editors are always very grateful for authors who don't give them any work to do. Now, having said all of that, I'm not going to introduce any of the speakers because that job belongs to my colleague, Gyula Kodolányi, and I now invite him to perform it. Gyula.
Thank you, John, for your kind introduction. I know that it's the worst habit to read out texts that are prepared beforehand, but I think that we are a little short of time, and being a writer, I don't trust my talking, I trust my writing. So I wrote something, an introductory, which I will try to read to you in an intelligible way. But of course, first of all, let me greet you in the name of Hungarian Review, in the name of my colleagues on the Hungarian Review team, many of whom have done a protracted editorial work on this book. I don't want to bring Nick into an inconvenient situation, but Nick's book gave us a damn lot of work. It's over 400 pages, full of allusions, references, and I think this time too I want to congratulate our editorial team, also Orsia Németh, who was especially trusted with being the copy editor of the book, and of course. We are very grateful to Danube Institute that Danube Institute undertook to be the hosts of this occasion. So I wrote something, and what I couldn't fit into this text, maybe I'll have a chance to say later on spontaneously. When you are faced with the somewhat awesome task of introducing this book, a large book, but also a great one, it is somewhat relieving to remember that its author also wrote a little book entitled The Xenophobe's Guide to the Austrians. That suggests that the impressive size and range of Nicholas Parsons' work, covering immense areas of cultural history, political thought, and human nature, never lacks a touch of irony and never lacks humor. Fortunately for us here in Budapest, he has not yet written the companion piece to this little book, The Xenophobe's Guide to the Hungarians. For it would certainly include touches of our national character that we are not proud of. Perhaps Nick also deterred from that project because his wife is Hungarian. A charming art historian, Ilona Sármány, whom we are greeting here, and formidable as charming Hungarian women can be, over the decades, Ilona also introduced Nick to the best of what the Hungarian spirit and Hungarian culture can offer to human achievement. Thus, one way of talking about Nicholas Parsons is the attempt to describe a lovely example of the Briton who develops an empathy to foreign cultures to a depth that is unique among the nations of Europe. Among all the foolish talk ignited by Brexit, there is the adage that Britons are, anyhow, not Europeans. But we do know that, on the contrary, Britons perhaps brought more understanding to the spirit of Europe than any other nationality. Thus, Nicholas Parsons, after graduating from Oxford, went to teach English in places like Tuscany and Athens. The fruit of the first station of his perennial European grand tour was the writing of a cultural guide to Tuscany. The second station, Athens, brought him not only a grasp of the culture of antiquity, but also an understanding of modern Greece that greets us in his essays on the condition of Europe today. And Athens also brought him the gift of meeting there his future wife. Tuscany has remained a cherished place on the spiritual map of Nicholas and Ilona, while the Austrian decades followed, during which Nicholas became an outstanding authority on things Austrian and on the mentality and culture of Vienna. With his wife, they have created friendships and close connections with the cultural and political elite of the Austrian capital. A memorable product of these years in Parsons' life is Vienna, a cultural and literary history. Hungary, of course, was always there in the back of Nick's mind, in Vienna too. There were the many visible and intellectual mementos of the dual monarchy, and visits to Hungary itself became ever more substantial as communism thawed in the 1980s, until in a peaceful revolution the nation took back its sovereignty into its hands. A landmark of the late 1980s in Nick's is Nick's Hungary, a Traveler's Guide. I have to tell you, and this is not my written text, that this was my first acquaintance with Nick's work, and I also have to tell you, through homage to Geza Enns, who is sitting at the back wall, I think, that it was Geza Enns who gave me Nick's guidebook. I think it's a fabulous book. It's the best modern account of Hungary's culture in English to this day. It tells a lot about the standards of our age, that when, a few years ago, I suggested to Nick to make a revised new edition of the book, he refrained from the task, saying that there would be no publisher to print it, for there were no more tourists to read it. By then, I had discovered Nick for Hungarian Review as a superb essayist, equally relevant whether writing on things Hungarian or Central European, or on the political and spiritual state of the Atlantic world. His insights on Hungary are fascinating, whether he writes on the friendship of the great 19th century reformer Count István Széchenyi and the engineer who built the Budapest chain bridge, Adam Clark, or when he wrote on the Hungarian Reformation, or when he writes on Hungary's struggle with the bureaucrats in Brussels and the slanted presentation of this struggle in the mainstream European press. As the editor-in-chief of Hungarian Review, I'm proud of initiating and publishing this book of essays, Civilization and Its Malcontents. I am grateful to Nick for writing many of the essays in the book for our journal. We must all be grateful to our friend John O'Sullivan, director of the Danube Institute and associate editor of Hungarian Review, for helping our efforts to bring this marvelous collection of essays together, giving invaluable editorial advice, and writing a brilliant foreword to the book. It is a foreword that gives us an intimate insight into the mind of Nicholas Parsons, a classical British liberal and a modern conservative, who eschews the ideological traps of our age and always looks at things as they really are, with a humane mind, a keen eye, and an ethical respect for toiling humankind. Well, I think this is good for an introduction, perhaps. And in the following, we will listen to Professor Enikő Bolobás's contribution to this evening. Then we will listen to Ferenc Hörher. And as the fourth program, we will listen to Anthony O'Hare, who will speak to us from England.
Dear friends, colleagues, and fellow masochists, I would like to thank you all very much for coming, and I'd like to thank the Danube Institute and the Hungarian Review for organizing this wonderful occasion, for me at any rate, in the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. It warms the cockles of my English heart to think that only a stone's throw away, Ferenc Deák used to set up his lodgings in the Angol Királynő Szálloda. Our queen is very, very old, but I believe this was an earlier queen. I'd like to thank Gyula very much for this over-generous introduction, and John O'Sullivan, who also, Gyula was the originator of this project and supported it from the beginning, and John not only selected the essays from a mess of pottage, one might say, of earlier essays, but wrote an over-generous foreword to it. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Orsi Németh, who was the best editor that anyone could possibly wish for. And working in her second foreign language, her English is slightly better than mine, and it was really wonderful for me. So, to the business. Let me begin with 3 quotations. The first from George Orwell's 1984. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. The second quotation is from the former leader of the German Greens, circa 2016, who said, There is no such thing as Germans, only migrants and non-migrants. The third is from the social historian Erich Kaufmann in his enormous study called White Shift, published in 2018, where he writes, "The argument that minority groups are encouraged to take pride in their identity, while whites are not, strikes me as undeniable in the present climate." This is someone from a left-leaning university faculty. Originally, I thought of calling this book European Identities. However, identity mongering has sadly become part of today's culture wars, and I wanted to convey an element of historical perspective in these essays. So a variation on the title of a famous essay by Sigmund Freud was decided on: Civilization and Its Malcontents. So who are the malcontents, and why are they malcontented? On the right, there are people who feel that the traditional politics of liberal democracy and its institutions had become increasingly inegalitarian, cronyist, and patronizing. On the left are people who believe that they have the key to social justice and increasingly share their opponents, that is on the right, a Manichaean view of the world in which the forces of darkness are locked in combat with the virtuous, that is them. Conservative historian Jeremy Black says his academic colleagues mostly regard conservatism as a pathology, not a legitimate political stance. Many conservatives feel that the apparent determination on the left to regard our entire Western civilization as little more than a history of atrocities carried into the present by systemic racism is equally a pathology. How did we get to here? Before we proceed to the realm of ideological abstraction, there are some concrete reasons. The essentially Keynesian post-war settlement in the West began to look wobbly in the 1970s and was increasingly replaced by what at first appeared to be a liberating prosperity turbine of neoliberalism. World poverty began decreasing, trade and living standards increasing. But with the collapse of the Soviet Empire in 1989, which had kept capitalism's wilder excesses in check, ideological competition to capitalism melted away. The most significant sign of this was the repeal of the USA's Glass-Steagall Act in 1999, which had obliged the banks to separate commercial from retail banking, and the somewhat similar Big Bang of 1986 in London. This provoked an avalanche of rapacious plunder, greed, and fraud in the financial sector, culminating in the crash of 2008. I deal with this in detail in a piece entitled "The Attempted Suicide of Capitalism." In the absence of what is known as moral hazard, where misjudgments or fraud have direct and dire consequences for their perpetrators, the state, i.e. the taxpayers, picked up the tab for this disaster in the developed countries. Not only in developed countries, of course. To put it another way, the financial sector committed the crimes, its victims paid the costs, a situation which the great Adam Smith had once warned against. The bankers seemed to argue that brilliance in their profession was to be excessively remunerated, whether they were precipitating financial meltdown or were being employed to clean up the mess they themselves had created. Handsome, silver-haired Jamie Dimon still presides at JP Morgan on an astronomical salary, $31.5 million in the last count, although his stewardship and that of his predecessor has cost the bank some $30 billion in penalties for malfeasance of one kind or another. God knows how much it has cost the bank's victims. At the same time as this was going on, economies became globalized and digitalization was revolutionizing the future structure of employment. Many people got very rich from all this, but arguably rather more saw a drop in their standard of living, the so-called left behinds. Fixed income small savers have been all but ruined by a decade of negative interest rates. These statisticians tell us that inequality has radically increased. French economist Thomas Piketty has inserted into the public space the idea that return on capital has well outstripped growth in GDP in the developed world, a sign, he says, that the already rich have got richer as the poor have got poorer. You might think that left-wing parties would be the beneficiaries of this, political parties. But generally, at least according to the liberal script, nationalism and populism have been. Why have voters so often turned right instead of left? Firstly, the liberal establishment has been deemed too complicit with what the Hungarians call vod kapitalismus. Secondly, the left appears to have abandoned its traditional base among the less or disadvantaged in favor of niche identity wars, human rights dogmas of mass immigration, and anti-patriotic bombast. The result is that the politics of conservative resentment confront the grievance studies of leftist academe. Thirdly, our societies have become transactional rather than morally responsible. Also, an ugly form of so-called surveillance capitalism has arisen through commercial exploitation of personal data. Beware the company mission statement. The one issued by Barclays Bank not so long ago proved on inspection to be almost identical to that issued by Enron, arguably the most fraudulent company in US history. Barclays has just escaped conviction for fraud because the court ruled that the company could not be held directly responsible for all the actions of the CEO, chief executive, but neither could the CEO be held directly responsible for all the actions of the company. So no one could be held responsible. Thank you and good night. The finance sector depends for its functioning on confidence, while democracy depends for its functioning on trust. Both have been in short supply. The foregoing is a rather unnuanced argument, but my book attempts to fill in a lot of the necessary details. In my essays on contentious topics such as populism, so-called progressive politics, the moral maze of immigration, Brexit, Islamism, and finally the commodification of culture and the greedy hypocrisy of the fashion industry, I have tried to steer a course between rival propagandas. If freedom of speech means anything, wrote George Orwell, it means the freedom to tell people what they do not want to hear. Voters have recently tended to exercise that freedom in regard to traditional political establishments, the latter being at first baffled, then angry at such lèse-majesté. An example of consequent double standards may be seen from prominent opponents of Brexit, who at first claimed that it was fascistic to claim that the people had spoken in the referendum of 2016. But those same prominent opponents ended up campaigning in 2019 for, guess what? A people's vote to overturn the result. Justified critique of the behavior of right-wing governments gets swept up into a rhetoric of general abuse and non sequiturs. What to make of my Viennese historian friend, who fixed me with a stare of owlish intensity and denounced the appalling and dangerous nationalism of the new Hungarian constitution because it decreed that Hungary's official name should be Magyarország. This, so he said, was extremely perilous because, so he said, Ország means Reich. No prizes for guessing which Reich he had in mind. Well, it's a point of view, but then again, he could have looked up the word Ország in the dictionary. Anyway, I asked him, was he not greatly alarmed that his own country was habitually referred to as Österreich? On the other hand, the danger of conservative governments permanently on an ideological war footing is loss of perspective and a tendency to believe that the end will justify the means. Substantial electoral support is still not a valid reason for trashing democracy. Left liberals in the EU tend to be enthusiastic about minority identities, but intensely suspicious of national ones politically articulated through the nation state, for example, Poland and Hungary. Usually, the horrors of Nazism and fascism are cited as the reason, although a prime cause for the rise of Nazism was the humiliation of Germany at Versailles, plus the attendant economic misery in Europe. Patriotism held together the alliance against Nazi Germany, patriotism of nation states. Indeed, the Soviet Union officially calls its participation in World War II the Great Patriotic War. General de Gaulle held together the Free French through what he called a certain idea of France. He once memorably said, "Patriotism is when love of your own people comes first. Nationalism when hate for people other than your own comes first." Mind you, he did once say that Belgium is a country invented by the English to annoy the French. The modern liberal left seems to have difficulty in distinguishing between the two de Gaulle categories. De Gaulle was himself one of the greatest 20th century politicians, successfully combining populism with democracy. But European liberals have lost their way on this. In my review article of Sir Paul Collier's masterpiece on immigration, entitled Exodus, I quote his candid view of the distinction between what have elsewhere been called the somewheres and, on the other hand, the anywheres, between those with a strongly located identity and, on the other hand, a generally affluent and mobile liberal elite which lacks one. Lifestyles, this is Collier, leading expert on migration in England, lifestyles such as those of my family, he says, are dependent, potentially parasitic, my italics, on those whose identity remains rooted, thereby providing us with the viable societies among which we choose. The consequences of weak national identity, he adds, are all too visible among the multicultural societies of Africa, where he conducts much of his research. It is notable that the most violent verbal attacks on Hungary and Poland come from Luxembourg, the country whose national identity, insofar as there is one, subsists in being a tax haven and money laundromat. In the USA, history faculties are engaged in warfare over a politically correct narrative which views the entire history of the country through the lens of slavery and the destruction of indigenous Americans. This necessarily airbrushes out the ore history of both America and Africa, insofar as that also featured enslavement and unending tribal warfare. Instead, it subordinates the other tradition of America as a beacon of freedom and progress to a stolen lands ideology. Sometimes the narrative is more obviously mendacious or ahistorical. For example, the statement of the chief librarian of the British Library that racism is the creation of white people. In fact, as the historian David Abulafia points out, racism goes back as far as we have records of humanity, and probably earlier. The Book of Han, 111 AD, was allegedly a prototype for the Han Chinese version, but racism stalked the earlier civilizations on the African continent. The fashionably inaccurate narrative of wholesale racist victimhood versus eternal white oppression is opposed by the French philosopher Pascal Bruckner, on whom I have a longish essay in the book. And he poses the question, how do we expect to be respected as a civilization if we no longer respect ourselves? My essays are designed to lend some historical perspective to these matters. They are certainly not an attempt to whitewash the misdeeds of Western civilization, which achieved its conquest through superior violence, as Samuel Huntington reminds us in his great book, The Clash of Civilizations. Then again, is anyone going to argue that the stupendous achievement of Islam never involved violence? John Maynard Keynes, echoing Toynbee, said that no civilization dies but by its own hand. And Edward Gibbon, the historian, has dwelt with perhaps excessive glee on the Roman Empire's loss of confidence in itself. But Gibbon was a product of the Enlightenment, and in chapter 38 of his great tome, he remarks that he had also come to the comforting conclusion that every age has increased the real wealth, the happiness, the knowledge, and perhaps the virtue of the human race. Of course, Gibbon took the view that this happy result was because of a civilized culture, technology, martial arts, religious zeal, and other factors had spread around what he called the savages of both the old and the new world. This is not a position likely to be greeted with enthusiasm on Facebook today. In conclusion, now, in case some of you are getting a bit anxious that my book consists of nothing but the hardcore porn of political commentary and cultural welfare, I am happy to tell you that there are also passages of deplorable levity and disrespectful verse. These may serve to relieve you temporarily from chilling contemplation of the climate Armageddon promised us by Saint Greta Thunberg, or more virtue-signaling videos from Harry and Meghan. Nor is my general attitude relentlessly downbeat. There are celebrations of individuals here who have influenced my Weltanschauung. Between the optimists and the pessimists sits the skeptic. Between Professor Pangloss and Schopenhauer sits Adam Smith. Megvagyunk, as the Hungarians say. Yogi Berra, the great American baseball star and homespun philosopher, used to say that predictions are notoriously difficult, especially about the future. Mind you, he did also say, you should always go to your friends' funerals. If you don't, they may not come to yours. Thank you for your attention.
Reading through Nicholas Parsons' book, it's 462 rather wide pages, packed with smallish letters, set kind of single-spaced. And actually reading it twice, because I had to prepare for this talk, it gave me a thrill. The thrill of racing through the highways of the intellectual dark web. I hope all of you know what the intellectual dark web is. I don't know if Mr. Parsons would agree, but this is so. I feel that I am in the company of Heather MacDonald, Douglas Murray, Titania McGrath, who are my heroes.
No need to indicate.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And on this highway, there is no speed limit to thought. Why? Let me start with what the book does not have, what does not contain. No processed, prepackaged ideas. No bias, no preconceptions, no political tribalism. Rather, the presentation of malcontents on both sides. No tight or narrow focus, no grievance studies, no chanting of hollow mantras or slogans, no virtue signaling, since the unapologetic scrutiny of ideas and events is a virtue that needs no signaling. In other words, not only is it original throughout, but as John O'Sullivan puts it in his foreword, it is the articulation of a consistent moral and political outlook, written in wonderfully melodious style, indeed. With its clear argumentation, it helps the readers clear up many obscurities, interpretations, terms, and distinction purposefully left hazy and foggy by others, while it also widens our perspectives by the author putting the examined phenomena into larger intellectual or just international contexts. Out of the many virtues of this collection of essays written over the last decade or so, I would only like to discuss three today. One, the diversity of its topics. Two, the wider intellectual and or international perspective. And three, its treatment of language. Diversity of topics. So what are the essays about? Well, be prepared for a long list, and yet still incomplete. Islam, Islamophobia, the EU, Central Europe, bien-pensant liberal discourse, Viktor Orban, Protestantism in Hungary, Austrian identity, travel guides and Baedekers, fashion of the nouveau riche, the removal and relocation of statues, the canon, poetry, actually bad poetry. The author's own intellectual heroes, among them some not properly appreciated figures such as Pascal Bruckner, Norman Douglas, Ian Greenlees, Norman Stone, our old friend, and the poet William McGonagall. And finally, we have poetry, mostly Parsons' own poetry, marking the section breaks. Number two, wider intellectual and or international contexts. First, we have the title, as well as the titles of the various chapters. The title obviously resonates with Freud. I would actually like to ask Nick to tell us exactly what the difference is between discontent and malcontent at some point. I looked up the dictionaries and I'm not still clear on it, but okay, that would come later. Then various titles that evoke classical texts, like elective affinities and desire for recognition, Goethe, Augustine Agonistes, Milton, the Balkans without Baedeker, for me, Burbank without a Baedeker, from T.S. Eliot, by T.S. Eliot, Sweetness of Light, Tyrannical Schoolmaster, the latter D.H. Lawrence, the former is more of a phrase. The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, obviously Buñuel. The Devil's Dictionary, Ambrose Bierce. I remember, the closing beautiful poem written by Parsons himself, Thomas Hood, from 1844. So these are the intellectual contexts. As to the international context, Parsons places each phenomenon into a wider perspective, highlighting the double standards applied by the liberal left. When discussing the charges against Orban, he draws attention to comparable policies introduced by British, Austrian, and US governments. He points out the double standards of liberal conflicts concerning Orban's ban on letting migrants on migrants in Hungary, the religious law that this government introduced, the drafting of a new constitution, his holding the banks accountable, or settling the retirement age, setting the retirement age of judges. And to cite one last example, writing on the statue park in Budapest, he lists several relocated statues that contribute to obliterating the memory of persons whose legacy, I quote here, the new ruling powers wish to remove from consciousness. Among them, Károlyi, replaced by Tisza, Andrássy equestrian statue brought back, Imre Nagy moved to Jászai Mari Square. But when he discusses all of these, he also talks about Vienna and Oxford and other cities. My third point, clarity of language. This is really what gave me total pleasure. It's total thrill, really. No, I mean, how can you write so beautifully? How can you? It's really, it's dizzying, it's dazzling. It's the Orwell tradition, he says, to which he belongs. I assume you say that somewhere, or did I just read that into the lines? That places such a great emphasis on the clarity of language, the mirror of clear thought. He cites Orwell saying, when words lose their meaning, men lose their freedom. Yes, this is it. This is the primary problem of our age. We cannot have it both ways, like Herbert Marcuse with his repressive tolerance, squeezing into the meaning of a word its own opposite. In rhetoric, it is called catachresis. It's a beautiful trope in poetry, but a deplorable one in political language. As it happens today in the discourse of the bien-pensant rhetoric of the liberal left, who seem to want to control language, to own words, to give them specific meanings. Parsons cites Pablo Iglesias, leader of the radical leftist Spanish party, Podemos, saying, reality is defined by words. So whoever owns the words has the power to shape reality. This desire to own words reminds us of Humpty Dumpty from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, who declares himself to be the master of language. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in rather a scornful tone, it means what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, Humpty Dumpty said, which is to be master? That's all. This is what we're talking about. On a more serious note, one is reminded of Imre Kertész, the Hungarian Nobel Prize laureate and Holocaust survivor, ever so sensitive of crimes of language, who insisted that totalitarian language is characterized by a whole vocabulary fabricated in order to mislead people as to the true nature of affairs, and with the purpose to brainwash those who had not yet converted. In such instances, language dictators, Kertész says, are trying to cover up the real meaning instead of articulating it. This process of stylization, he says, consists in the hypocritical tactfulness of evading truth for its violent brutality. What words do I have in mind? Well, for one, progress, a word that is being appropriated, hijacked by the radical leftist discourse as the term for self-identification. Hence, progressives and the progressive movement. Explaining the complexity of progressive thinking, Parsons insists that there are two forms of progress, two strands of progressive thinking behind the migration crisis. One stresses that Europe is morally obliged to open its doors to would-be immigrants, partly because of its past misdeeds. The other believes that the EU represents a gold standard of democracy, freedom, and tolerance, a standard not shared by these excessively intolerant immigrants. He also raises the question of how anti-Western Muslim groups can represent progressive forms of struggle. Muslims who do not hunger for pluralism and democracy, freedom of speech, tolerance of other beliefs, female emancipation, separation of religion from political governance, and have not adjusted to secularism. Other words include the NGO, for example. NGOs who are unable to decide whether they are working to help people or are looking for help for people in order to promote themselves. Respect is also a part of the bien-pensant rhetoric of the liberal left, demanding unqualified, non-judgmental respect for a highly illiberal and even violent aspect, or illegal and violent aspects of immigration culture. And they demand tolerance for a culture that does not reciprocate tolerance. Another word, victimhood. Here too, meanings get blurred. For radical Islam, Parsons insists, speaks two languages, that of the victim and that of the executioner. They want to overthrow the West and yet at the same time join it. And the liberal media here is complicit in not calling things what they actually are. But to continue the list of words that have been pirated recently, bien-pensant itself, I would say, if only liberals were thinking right. Then words that are supposed to signal the left as virtuous. Cases of such leftist virtue signaling include human rights, diversity, equality, social justice, fairness, refugee instead of migrant, and a whole lexicon of words associated with the politics of victimhood and identity. Finally, such desire to own language, or to be the master, as Humpty Dumpty wished, certain words are banned by the thought police. For example, ország in Magyarország, or would be banned had they the power. And others are being excluded to embargo various critiques, for example, that of Islam. In closing, I would just like to mention that Parsons' own poetry separates the sections. I want to read 4 lines here from I Remember, I Remember. I learned the Magyar faith. It's a long poem. It's like 6 pages or 8 pages. Beautiful. Sorry. I learned the Magyar faith. All masochists must master. For every day that brings success, another brings disaster. There is one essay that I haven't mentioned that is the most important politically, but everyone should read it, and that is Hungary, Democracy and the Liberal Media. And it's a very new, very objective, very professional, scholarly treatment of the charges brought against Orbán and Parsons' own critique of Orbán. And so I would very much recommend that. It is an updated version of an essay that appeared in Quadrant in May 2016. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've got a written text, so I will read it out in quotations. Anything but an ideologue, on Nicholas T. Parsons and his essays. The quotation is from John's introduction. It is only natural that I should also start with a quotation from the artistic reconstruction of Budapest 1900 by John Lukács, the late professor of history. I quote, "Somewhat like parts of London in the 18th century or Philadelphia in the 19th, this smoky, swollen, crowded, and metropolitan Budapest was still a city with a country heart, with a sense that a provincial Arcadia was but an arm's length anyway." End of quote. In order not to give in to this bucolic intro, let me moderate it by another formulation of the same idea from the very same book. I quote, "Budapest 1900 was not inspired by nostalgia, but rather by an attraction caused by," once again the quotation, "the coexistence of a virile and sometimes coarse provinciality, together with an urban sensitivity and authentic sophistication that was unusual because it was Magyar, as well as cosmopolitan." End of quote. If foreign visitors happen to fall in love with or in Budapest, they seem to have similar impressions. They tend to have the feeling here that they travel back into the 19th century Philadelphia or 18th century London. When Nicholas T. Parsons moved to live in Budapest and Vienna, he also might have had a similar cultural shock. Yet by now he seems to feel at home in this Central European context. What is more, by now he is himself a guide in English language for English language readers to the afterlife of the good old dual monarchy. The title of the book rephrases the title of the famous Viennese psychologist Sigmund Freud. Yet the book itself is a collection of essays written for English-speaking readers by someone who has got a real familiarity with the rather dispendious world of Central Europe and who is able to look at the Western world from this angle of Europe. His essays are indeed fresh because of this ability to look at known things, events, phenomena, or tendencies, as if he looked at them for the first time. He is able to see the world with a Central European eye. Essay writing is one of the luxuries of Western culture, made available to its best authors and its most refined audiences. Its distinguishing mark is that it allows its author the freedom to tackle any issue which comes forth, no matter if it has any utility or other non-evident merits or not. From Bacon to Montesquieu to Eliot and Orwell, This is a European affair. Yet, Central Europe seems to cherish essay writing more than any other parts of the world. Think of authors like Zbigniew Herbert or the Hungarian László Csészabó. Central European culture offers a long history and a wide variety of voices to enchant readers, with intriguing stories of the past, vexing stories of the present, and perplexing stories of an imagined or possible future. Although Mr. Parsons is a typical representative of the British tradition of essay writing, as it has developed from Bacon on to the 20th century, he seems to have learned a lot from this art of Mitteleuropa. This is due to his second identity, if this is not a contradiction in terms in his case, his Central European persona, and in particular to his marriage to Ilona Sármány. His book is published by the Hungarian Review, of which he has been a regular contributor. And Hungarian Review is one of the key trustees of this tradition, even since Gyula Szekfy and the great tradition of the essay writers in the interwar period. This journal refused to become a professional periodical. It's a cultural magazine in the original sense of the word, and a trustee of the original form of essay writing. Parsons belongs to the intellectual circle of Hungarian Review, and his loyalty to this literary genre is in tune with this orientation. His voice is clear, cultured, and conservative, yet clairvoyant and ironically critical. He seems to be free of the typical prejudices of culture warriors. He enjoys to contradict well-established truths or fashionable dogmas. His is an open mind, which finds the issues that bother us, reluctant and lazy readers, and provides an insightful analysis of them without attempting to force on us the author's own verdicts. Instead, it offers alternative perspectives on the same phenomenon in order to allow us to choose our own preferred version of it, and this way to encourage us to reflect on the issue for ourselves. In the same time, his profile will soon take shape in the texts, allowing us to appreciate its efforts to learn more about the world around us and about himself. Let me be more direct. In what follows, I try to give a general argument which I find is Parsons' positivist position, which I find Parsons' position, why I find Parsons' position sympathetic. This will be followed by some cherry picking. I try to reflect on some of what he addressed to his talk. It is John O'Sullivan who characterizes Mr. Parsons' position the following provocative way in the foreword of the book. I quote, "Nick Parsons is a traditional English liberal of a prudent conservative disposition." End of quote. This is a tricky description, as it reveals two opposite traits in the author by now belonging to the two opposing sides of our ill-fated culture war. Yet it seems to me to be a correct description of the author's position. As far as his writings are concerned, they certainly present an authorial position which can perhaps best characterized as classical liberal. And classical liberals, from Montesquieu to Tocqueville, from Macaulay to Lord Acton, to be sure an endangered species by now, did indeed often have, I quote, a prudent conservative disposition. The more so if they were traditional and English, or Anglophile, to be sure. And, by the way, liberals. English, traditional, and liberals. We can have no doubt Mr. Parsons is loyal to these traditional English liberal views and will not sacrifice in the intellectual profile to surf on the latest radical waves of political fashion. This is not a book which is written to be used as a weapon in the ideological warfare of our times. Instead, it is offered as a work of art, which helps to make sense of our times without being too fast or too black and white in its evaluations. As the subtitle claims, these are indeed essays on our times. The author exercises his own political judgment on a regular basis, but not with the intention to save us from the same exercise. On the contrary, the best thing of his success, the best sign of his success would be if we, readers, would learn to make reserved or reasoned, reflective or responsive political judgments of what happens around us, sometimes even within us, today and tomorrow. His book could be seen as a guidebook. Recall Antal Serb's Guide to Budapest, the Martian's Guide to Budapest, or to the famous book by George Mikes, the famous Hungarian exile, entitled How to Be an Alien, a handbook for beginners and more advanced pupils. It is not surprising that both of these authors are close to his heart. An excerpt from Serb's book is used as a motto for the chapter, Your City, My City, Their City, Budapest and the Guidebook genre, which is partly about the genre of the guide, which readers often prefer even to fiction or to poetry, and partly about Budapest, the author's second hometown by now, with and in competition with Vienna. George Mikes is even more in the focus of Mr. Parsons' interest. He succeeded to slip into the title of another chapter, How to Be a Magyar, in homage to George Mikes, who instructed the Brits in their idiosyncrasies. Not a weapon, something like a guidebook. By relying on these metaphors, did we get closer to the nature of the rich volume and its honorable author? If not, let me once again ask the help of John Lukács. When distinguishing nationalism and patriotism, Mr. Parsons quoted, as we heard, General de Gaulle. Let me quote to compare it with that quotation, the historian of de Gaulle, John Lukács, who identified patriotism with, I quote, the love of one's land and its history, and identifies nationalism the following way: while nationalism is a vicious cement that binds formless masses together. Conclusion. De Gaulle, Parsons, and Lukács, not George, but John Lukács, seem to share this inclination to stay close to the golden mean between collectivism and the radical right populist agenda. The same is true, I guess, of Adam Smith, another hero of Parsons. This famous moral philosopher of the Scottish and until now British Enlightenment serves Parsons to indicate his own position more clearly than any metaphor could. He said, or wrote, by the way, I quote, "Between the optimists and the pessimists sits the skeptic. Between Professor Pangloss and Schopenhauer sits Adam Smith." End of quote. This quotation seems to me a really sympathetic position, quite close to my own one, which could be identified as that of another Brit from the late 18th century, Edmund Burke. I guess this connection, the Smith-Burke axis, can be finally used to describe my take on Mr. Parsons' wonderful art of essay writing. And to underline the importance of this axis, let me refer to the late Roger Scruton, who would certainly have agreed with the classical liberal Parsons' cautionary remark, which we conservatives should all take seriously. And I quote, "The danger of conservative governments permanently on an ideological war footing is loss of perspective and a tendency to believe that the end will justify the means. Substantial electoral support is still not a valid reason for trashing democracy." End of quote. This is the lesson we conservatives have to learn from people like Mr. Parsons. How to save democracy and the national political community with the help of a bit of skepticism about our own ideological doctrines, even if, surprisingly, we happen to be, on the whole, right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Niko Bolobash. Thank you, Ferenc Hörher. And of course, first of all, thank you, Nick. I'm sorry that I missed to introduce you the previous time. But first of all, I think we have to ask for the forgivingness of Professor Anthony O'Hare, who must be sitting in suspension in Britain. He probably doesn't know that Hungarians have this rather awful habit that they never keep reasonable time limits at conferences. I'm sorry to say this because I think the contributors were really brilliant, but at the same time we are asking for the understanding of Professor O'Hare, and I hope that our technical staff will be able to bring him here among us and join in the discussion. Please, Professor O'Hare.
I've just got a few reflections on what I think is actually a wonderful book. And as people have pointed out, it covers a great many topics and a great many different things, including a scintillating article on the art market. But I can't go into any of that. I'm going to talk about liberalisms, liberal and illiberal, on the basis of what I think Nicholas Parsons says about this. In the autobiographical poem at the end of Civilisation and Its Malcontents, he writes, this is Nicholas Parsons writes, "Our voice is still and small, in other words, ignored." And I think there are surely echoes of Chesterton here. We are the people of England that never have spoken yet. And I'm sure that Chesterton would have warmed to Parsons' earlier observation in the poem about the bankers who ripped us off, then had us bail them out. Well, we've just heard him agreeing with that. It is not, as he says, Parsons, what's right and wrong, but who has got the clout. Chesterton, writing in 1908, spoke prophetically of the new breed of lords, the new masters of the universe. And this is Chesterton, "Lords without anger and honour, who dare not carry their swords. They fight by shuffling papers. They have bright, dead, alien eyes. They look at our labour and laughter as a tired man looks at flies, and their load of loveless pity is worse than ancient wrongs." Parsons' animus is very much against our present-day governors, shuffling the papers with which they entangle and entrap us, and also against the veneer of moralism with which they hide their true intent. Loveless pity indeed. Fascinatingly for a British reader, Parsons speaks not just for the people of England, but also for the people of Hungary, who, under Viktor Orban's democratic government, have become the bad boys of the European Union, mainly for standing out against the pitiless pieties of the corporate lords and the Brussels bureaucrats. In a passage which might strike a chord with some Black Lives Matter votaries, Parsons is illuminating about how the depredations, or supposed depredations, of the Fidesz government pale in comparison to the way democracy operates in the USA. So look at pages 334 to 5 of his book. And also about how apparently virtuous EU member states such as Austria are not in practice that different from Hungary under Fidesz, pages 337 to 339. In two substantial chapters, Parsons outlines some of the many shifting and evasive top-down arrangements in the EU, including notably over Greece, pages 106 to 29. So, assuming that the USA, along with the EU, is the paradigm case of liberal democracy, can we begin to see something in favour of illiberal democracy? Illiberal democracy would seem to be a setup, such as Hungary, in which democracy prevails, but without the stultifying carapace of liberal, or, in inverted commas, liberal, pieties and prejudices. The point here is not precipitately to accede to a wholly negative view of the USA, or indeed of the EU, which post-1945 does, or did, have some decent intentions, in particular to convert formerly hostile and warmongering European nations into peaceful market economies. But talk of illiberal democracy, in contrast to liberal democracy, suggests that before condemning others for their supposed defects, one should take a look at oneself, and especially at how oneself might appear to others. If nothing else, Parsons provides an object lesson in what doing just that might do for some of those who preach virtue to their less fortunate neighbours, and particularly to those neighbours who, against the bien-pensant consensus over globalism, whether banker-inspired or left ideologically motivated, see some virtue in nationhood in general and in their own nationhood in particular. In an essay discussing the great 19th century Hungarian patriots, Széchenyi and Kossuth, Parsons interestingly points out that Charles Dickens, no less, was an admirer of Széchenyi's personalist approach to reform. I mean, he thought reform should be of the person, as against Kossuth's more political temper. In an article Dickens wrote, some years after Széchenyi's death, Dickens applauds the latter's insistence that a change of heart is what is needed, rather than grandstanding virtue-signalling politics and bureaucratic philanthropy. And Dickens quotes with approval the words Széchenyi put into Kossuth's mouth: "I aspired to command others, I could not govern myself. It was my boast to be the benefactor of my country. It is my shame to have been only the puppet of her popular passions." That's Széchenyi speaking on behalf of Kossuth. Shades there of Dickens' own excoriating portraits of Mrs. Jellyby and Mr. Bumble, energetic hypocrites who neglect the real needs of those close to them in their cold-hearted crusades to save Africans in Africa or to reform the indigent poor in their own country. Now, it might be thought that the concept of the indigent poor was an outmoded Victorian concept, gone with the shades of Malthus and Bentham. It has not gone. It has simply morphed into another form. As Parsons points out on page 156, advocacy of meritocracy, which we are all supposed to believe in under a commitment to so-called equality of opportunity, has as its implication that were such equality actually to be achieved, while those who succeed in the merit stakes will congratulate themselves on what they have deserved, those who fail to rise will equally deserve their fate. Meritocracy, the rule of the deserving, is as harsh a doctrine as any devised in the 19th century. And it is just what we see when corporate lords and leftist academics condemn those who have the temerity to disagree with them on such matters as Brexit and American elections as ignorant nationalists, as well as probably racist and certainly deplorable. On page 79, Parsons tellingly quotes Roger Scruton. This is from Roger. "Sentimental people respond more warmly to strangers than to those who are close to them, and are more heatedly concerned by abstract issues which demand no personal sacrifice than by concrete obligations that cost time and energy to fulfill." And indeed, this is me now, not Roger Scruton, for those professing these abstract causes, there are careers, honours and riches to be gained, all the while appearing sea-green incorruptibles. Those who disagree are made to look mean, selfish, ungenerous, and no doubt uneducated to boot, given that education, and not just state education, is largely predicated on the propagation of those abstract principles and causes. And a case in point here is immigration. Advocacy of unlimited migration, or no borders, is something of a litmus test in the present-day world, which Parsons characterizes as an environment hostile to personal authenticity and dominated by branded intellectual or cultural goods, empty slogans, aggressive marketing, and invasion of personal privacy. He goes on to quote approvingly from a recent book by an Austrian writer, Alfred Gubran. This is Gubran. The protagonist of this controlling world is the identity-free man who keeps himself in power by means of rules and regulations. And this should remind us that state regulation is as effective a means for an elite to subjugate a population as are nationalization or the exercise of naked power. Unlike these other two routes to control as well, regulation is likely to be welcomed by large corporations as it tends to make things more difficult for smaller and less bureaucratically upholstered enterprises. But there is, in fact, nothing new in the protagonist of the controlling world vesting himself or herself in a cope of impeccably liberal abstract principles. As Maurice Cowling showed in Mill and Liberalism, his book Mill and Liberalism, as long ago as 1963, to the horror of the left liberal intelligentsia of his day, John Stuart Mill's liberalism could, and indeed should, be seen as a way of sidelining all those who did not share Mill's impeccably rationalistic progressivism and anti-clericalism. Mill's celebrated advocacy of a diversity of opinion was not a plea for diversity simpliciter. And despite appearance, Mill was not really against consensus. Actually, he was very much in favour of it, providing it was a consensus directed by a suitably progressive clerisy, by people like him, in fact. As Cowling points out, fundamental moral and political commitments are not arrived at by a process of rational argumentation or critical self-examination. They are too deep for that, a matter rather of an intuitive and pre-rational sense that, say, a human being before me is qualitatively different from a stick or a broom, even, perhaps especially, if that human being is a miserable, undeserving beggar. If fundamental commitments, though, are too deep to be supported, or indeed to require support, by discursive rational argumentation, which does not mean that they are irrational, they can be undermined by the type of endlessly reason-seeking argument and negative challenge Mill wanted us to engage in. And of course it's Cowling's point that he wanted us to engage in that sort of thing precisely to undermine some of these fundamental commitments. Hence the progressives' disdain for those who hold to ancestral prejudices, and I'm using prejudice in the Burkean sense. Burke, by the way, was Irish, not English or Scottish, and that's very important, in fact. The progressives' disdain for those who hold to ancestral prejudices about the nation, the family, the sanctity of marriage, birth, breeding, honour, and discipline. As George Orwell, from whom I take this list, pointed out in Inside the Whale, all these things can be turned inside out in 3 minutes by, quote, anyone of ordinary education, assuming, of course, that they've been educated by the likes of Mill. But this does not mean that anyone of ordinary education is right, or the prejudgment, the prejudice, wrong, nor does it mean that the Mill-inspired critical thinker is going to show greater wisdom morally, politically, culturally, or personally. But it does tell us why the academic and the intellectual, in the tradition of Mill, is likely to stand on one side on all those issues, and why he or she is likely to deplore what will be seen as the unenlightened nature of his or her opponent. Hence, as Parsons so persuasively demonstrates in his book, liberalism, that is, the post-million liberalism of our present-day elites, is in fact anything but liberal. They shuffle their papers without laughter or pity. Talk of diversity notwithstanding, they have no truck with any current of feeling or opinion which would challenge, to use one of their own words, their hegemony. Neither do they show any understanding of the deep feelings and loyalties of the ordinary, unenlightened man or woman, for whom I think Parsons is speaking in his book, which I commend to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor O'Hare. I think we are all grateful for your contribution. Personally, I am reminded that one of the interesting features of this afternoon or evening here is that George Orwell once more seems to be the great hero of the 20th century. And I think his thought is being reborn again and again, and really because his roots in culture and in his love of the common man are so strong, as you have again called attention to this. We are asking you to stay with us because a period of questions follows. In other words, we are expecting or looking forward to questions from the audience addressed to any of the previous four speakers. I see Professor Bolobash ask.
I was just wondering if Nick could respond to the title, question about the title.
Yes.
What's the difference between discontent and malcontent?
Yes, okay.
My understanding is that the description of Iago in Othello is that he was a malcontent.
Okay.
So in other words, it is of course a little bit archaic, but the malcontent is the person, whereas Freud's title dealt with the thing.
Okay, really? Okay.
A malcontent person is certainly discontented.
Okay.
And so that's the...
That's not what dictionaries say, but I believe you, rather.
I have written a dictionary of my own.
Okay. I trust that. Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you for this. We were leading a long-lasting debate about the title of the book, because my own feeling was also that although it's a variation on the Freud title, in other respects, the thought of our friend Nick is very, very different from the thought of Freud. But of course, it's always very useful to use a famous and popular title and change it. Well, let's come back to our audience, and we are looking forward to questions, as I said. Yes, please.
I think it would be interesting to unpack a little bit how you think your thought is different from that of Freud, because that now because now this discussion about the title led to this idea about the civilization and discontent of the civilization, and you are talking about the malcontent of the civilization. And I think it is kind of not that different from what Freud was hinting about.
The way I'd answer that is that my malcontents, my book, Iago-like, are persons on both sides of these arguments. And they have reacted in political terms, in some cases even, of course, with violence in extreme cases. As far as I understand it anyway, the article by Freud, also is a long, almost book-length piece, he is talking about the results of sexual repression that influence the frustrations in civilization. And I don't think the two are necessarily incompatible, but they are different. And I'm citing people who, for example, take a very extreme view when tackled on certain shibboleths that they share, and react in a political way, somewhat dishonestly, as we all know Iago did.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you for the interesting talks.
Could you give your name, please?
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Sorry. I just wanted to do that. I am Peter Molnar, and thank you for the thought-inspiring presentations. My question is about what do you think of the removal of statues in the U.S. and West Europe, and where would you draw the line? Do you see in some cases it justified, in some cases it is not? I myself wrote a book chapter on a Teddy Roosevelt statue. Teddy Roosevelt was sitting on a horse. On one side an African was walking, the other side a Native American chief. I myself suggested to put a responding statue next to it, sort of like discussing history, but finally the statue will be or maybe already removed. So I wonder what is Mr. Parsons' view on it, and maybe others as well. Thank you.
Shall I answer?
Yes, please.
My view is that it is ahistorical to topple statues, but there are ways of dealing with statues which I greatly admire, for example, in Hungary, whereby the socialist realist statues were not destroyed. They were collected, preserved. Some of them, of course, are artistically considerable, and they are, as you all know, put out in the Statues Museum near the town of Erd. And it's advertised in the tourist books, and you can go and look at those things. But it was necessary, it was felt, and I think probably most Hungarians would have agreed, to make a visible break with the past then, the recent past, I should also add. And this was a way of doing it which I don't regard to be uncivilized or barbarian.
Thank you. Please.
There's classic liberalism and people who are wedded to and committed to, they wouldn't use the word classical, they say, I'm liberal. Looking at how liberalism is evolving or has evolved, we're now very much talking about classical liberalism, neoliberalism, progressive liberalism, and so on. There is almost a wall for people who would consider themselves liberal and to be absolutely resistant to any notion that the evolution of liberalism has occurred. I have no idea how to get beyond that block. And it's a huge divide for people who, certainly I would say the person liberal and decades liberal is a person of quality, sincerity, integrity, but they seem to be out of touch with a lot of the trends that are indeed, and they discount them. They say because it can't be, and they aren't real liberals, and so on. Do you understand my question?
I do understand your question.
Thank you. Yes.
And I rather agree with what I take to be the premise of it. The trouble with our situation at the moment is, of course, a polarization. There used to be possible to bridge people of different political persuasions, which are different ideologies, within a democracy. And America was famous at building rainbow coalitions, which it still does to some extent, of either within the Republicans or within the Democrats. This left, of course, no room for third parties. As far as I remember, no third parties ever got to be president. But it retained an element of continuity and harmony within the political system. That seems to have broken down. And it does break down if either side, conservative or progressive liberal, decides that they won't really accept the result of, say, a popular vote. So what's obviously something like a referendum is a popular vote. And in fact, there was an article in the Financial Times, one of their, which I thought was very revealing. He said, the result of Brexit shows that the national matters of national interest should not be decided by referendum, should not be decided by popular democracy, I think was what he said. Well, you have to ask, if the voters are not allowed to vote on matters of national interest, what are they to be allowed to vote on? And this kind of myopia, the poor old Financial Times, now known as the Brussels Pravda, gets itself into a terrible muddle about this, in my view. I give another example of something that's curious about these embedded attitudes. I think Professor Hare was mentioning them, of an elite that considers itself, as it were, not only, if necessary, the setter of the rules, but then above the rules. And that's a rather unhealthy result. And with Brexit, I gave an example in my address, but of course it applies elsewhere. The difficulty is now that the methods of voting in democracies have been hugely changed by social media, which allows penetration into the argument from a much wider range of people. So people aren't just fed, as it were, the party line by two dominant parties, but they have a vast array of other voices casting doubt on that. In theory, this should be healthy for democracy. But of course, the world being what it is, we haven't quite mastered how to separate malignant and fake news and simple untruths being spread quickly on social media and possibly influencing people's votes, although the latest report on Brexit, interestingly, from the Information Commissioner in England, has just said that the canard that was launched immediately after it, after the result of the vote was known, that they were influenced by Cambridge Analytica, which is a specialist in social media techniques, has been completely exploded by this report. And since we've been getting in the Observer and the Guardian endless claims that the result was manipulated, this would seem to settle the argument, and I think justly so. I believe President Obama was about the first to use social media very effectively in getting elected in America. So there are various factors involved, but in principle I agree with the premise of your question.
Thank you very much, Nick. As I see the dynamics of modern ideas, there's a very interesting, to me there seems to be a very interesting regularity. When they become too successful, they basically destroy everything around themselves. And so basically what you have here, yes, we all feel, I think, what the previous question talked about, how liberalism became from a very distinguished word and value, how it decayed to our day, and it's losing its meaning, certainly in the eyes of people like myself. And I think it's really that if individual freedom is taken to the extreme, it basically destroys human tissue, community, society around itself. And that's the problem. That's why liberalism has failed by our day.
Can I make one other?
Yes, sir. Mr. Parsons.
Sorry, just one quick
something.
Just something occurred to me. The going back partly to the question of statues and the rest. Black Lives Matter it takes its cue partly from something called critical race theory, and that has been developed in academia, mostly in the USA, and that is a very effective. Black Lives Matter is a very effective slogan because basically there is no way in which somebody can say, now, I am not a racist, because they are then told that they are unconsciously racist. And there are now disturbing courses which are rather reminiscent of Chinese communist re-education, where they are sent for it to be explained to them where they are unconsciously racist. The other point about that is a powerful political weapon, probably the most powerful I've seen in my lifetime, a slogan like that, because actually there is no redemption, because you are responsible as white people for all the evils of history. Of Western civilization is inherently, as I quoted that lady, racist, and there is no redemption. You can say, well, you know, we abolished the slave trade in 1833 and then policed it. You know, that's not an allowable get-out. You are absolutely stuck with that. And just to finish, that kind of, to my mind, political hypocrisy, I want to quote Friedrich Engels, who owned a cotton mill, by the way, and in Anti-Düring he said this: without slavery, no Greek state, no Greek art and science, but without the basis laid by Hellenism and the Roman Empire, also no modern Europe. We should never forget that our whole political and intellectual development presupposes a state of things in which slavery was necessary as it was universally recognized. Without slavery of antiquity, no modern socialism.
Yes. Yeah, let me add something to this. You know, unfortunately, we who have lived here for some time, to us, you know, the idea that all whites are, responsible for the crimes committed by American society reminds us very much of the term class alien in Hungary. You know, this came into fashion in around 1948, and basically anyone could be termed a class alien who was not a day laborer. And of course, according to this usage, Count István Széchenyi, of course, was also a class alien of some sort, you know, an oppressor. But you said you wanted to join the debate on liberalism, so please, Annika, you were first?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Now, I just want to make 2 points. I totally agree with Ms. Kerekes about the wall separating classical liberal thought from contemporary so-called liberal thought. I only am reminded of Gloria Steinem, for example, who has become a pariah for feminists today, and many other classical second wave, but first generation, second wave feminists who made a difference at that point. And I very much agree with what Nicholas Parsons says there, quoting T.S. Eliot about from tradition and the individual talent. We have all these classical dead authors, but says the student, we know so much more than they do, and then the answer is, well, exactly, it's them that we know now. They are the more that we know. I didn't quote it properly. Anyway, so I think many people share your uneasiness and discomfort, identifying with, like, for example, feminists like me. I am an old, probably the first of the first feminists in Hungary. Nobody wrote about these issues before I did in the late 70s and early 80s, and from then on. But it's very difficult to justify transgender and activism. Transgender phenomena, obviously, one has nothing, I mean, that's everybody's own business, but as activism of any kind, this kind is problematic for me. And just one last remark. You brought up the issue of Black Lives Matter and collective guilt. You said when a whole class is stigmatized as hostile and enemy, and when white football players are forced to take the knee in asking forgiveness for racism that we had, or slavery that they had nothing to do with. Now, can I ask a provocative question? In Hungary, we were quite proud that after the change of regime, we had no severe lustration laws. But would you just imagine who would need to take the knee? The children of which classes, and before the children of which classes? Because those are not impersonal, collective guilts, but very personal, particular guilt committed by fathers or people themselves, fathers of this generation, or the older generation, of course, but still my generation, or they themselves, you know, when they actually committed that guilt. Would it be totally absurd if we followed this line of logic, to demand that children of AVO parents took the knee before victims, before children of AVO's victims today? Thank you.
Yes, I also appreciate the question about liberalism and the different genres or movements, periods of it. And I would respond to it this way. I think that at this very moment, classical liberals are in a delicate situation. Because first of all, they are liberals. And on the other hand, the sort of topics, issues that are presented in the name of liberalism by radical left liberals or progressivists are unacceptable by liberal standards. So it would be a contradiction in terms if they could, subscribe for them. So in a way, I think that it is the moment when classical liberals have to choose which way to go. Whether they go for actually, the conservative agenda, because that's where they find, their values, free speech, freedom of association, all that, or they want to keep the name and therefore throw out all the values. I think that's the problem at the moment, and authors like J.K. Rowling, I think, actually realize that this is the key moment when you have to choose. And just one final moment. Yesterday we had a talk at my institute at the University of Public Service, where that was a webinar as well, and we had as an invited speaker John Dunn from Cambridge University, one of the big names of the Cambridge-style history of political thought, and of course, as his self-definition goes, he is a leftist, very strongly identifying himself with the left agenda, with the Labour Party. On the other hand, when we asked the question, one of us asked the question, what do you think about the new phenomena on the campuses, basically in the US, but by now already appearing in Oxford, of cancel culture and safe space? How do you react on that? And he said that, well, in my youth, I was very happy that in the Union I could express my leftist agenda even within a very strong conservative mainstream. And nobody, objected against it. So I want to keep that tradition, and I don't want to see that sort of thing happening to destroy academic freedom for any ideological agenda. And I think that Mr. Parsons' position is, in that respect, quite, remarkable, because what he points at is that no ideology, please.
Thank you much, Ferenc. We are we are thanking Professor O'Hare for his patience, because he's in a more in a sense he suffers a handicap, not seeing us, but he listened carefully, I think, to our debates, and let me ask him if he has any comments on the subjects that came up previously in the last few minutes.
Well, I do have a comment about liberalism, but I'd make it by going back to the Enlightenment itself. And it seems to me that there are certainly two, possibly more, Enlightenments. There's the French Enlightenment, which is characterized by Diderot and Voltaire, and in a way was powerful within the French Revolution. There's also the Enlightenment in which I'd place Adam Smith, David Hume, and Burke, all Celts, notice, Irish and Scots. Now, if you look at the French Enlightenment, there was something rather narrowly, shallowly indeed, rationalistic about this. And, I just have to remind you of Voltaire's phrase, écraser l'infâme, talking about the church, tear down the past through reason. And of course, as we saw George Orwell pointing out, if you use reason like a kind of forensic tool, it can unpick almost anything. What united Burke and Hume, and to an extent Adam Smith and Reid and people of that sort, was that they distrusted the naked power of reason. What did Hume say? Reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. I don't actually agree with that, but they certainly realized the limitations of reason. And as indeed did Karl Popper, a famous modern liberal thinker, who has a lot to teach us, by the way, about not tolerating the intolerant. So I think that within liberalism itself, or within the Enlightenment itself, there's a split between people who use reason in an uncritical way and those who are skeptical of the power of reason, its justification, and so on. And in a way, some of that, I think, is what we're seeing today, because some of the people who don't seem to be approved of in this gathering, they are, in an uncritical way, without any respect for the past, they are in a way using reason to tear down, well, of course, they're now trying to tear down the liberal values themselves, because liberal values are not self-evident. So I think that what we're seeing is, in a way, is a kind of fissure within the Enlightenment itself and within a number of traditions, all of which have some claim to the title liberal. So perhaps actually liberal isn't a very helpful word, because it has different resonances and different implications and a different force depending on who's using it. And of course, we now have a Liberal Party in England. The party that's called the Liberal Party is, in many respects, anything but liberal. Words mean what I say they mean.
Thank you, Professor O'Hare. Do you have any response to that, Mr. Parsons?
Only one comment to try and sum up. I entirely agree with all that was said by the professor, but something that characterized the debate now came very, very clearly over to me watching a CNN panel during the hearings of Brett Kavanaugh to the appointment at the Supreme Court. And a lady commentator on the CNN panel said the following: "He has been accused, therefore he is guilty." I disagree.
Thank you so much. I think this was a brilliant last sentence to a very, very I think a very, very valuable debate that we have here. So I'm asking now John O'Sullivan to, as our host, to close down this day, and thank you very much for your attention.
Well, Gyula, I'd like to thank you and all of the speakers. I think it's been a little feast of intellectual debate and argument. I think that itself is a tribute to Nick's book, since that's the spirit of the book. I've enjoyed it enormously, and I judge from the response of the audience. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank you, Gyula, and I want to say how much a great pleasure it's been for me to have been associated with this wonderful book, and hope that you will all buy copies, 2 in fact, 1 for yourself and 1 to give to your friends, 3, and 1 to leave on a bus so that members of the public can be converted to these interesting ideas. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you so much.